مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. لحملة انتخابات أمريكا الرئاسية جوانب غريبة كثيرة عدا كيف تقاد النقاشات حول السياسة الخارجية تحت الصدر القائمة. بين الجمهوريين قال دونالد ترامب أن مصدر معظم أفكاره حول السياسة الخارجية مشاهدة البرامج التلفزيونية صباح الأحد. وبين الديمقراطيين استأست على برني ساندرز الإجابة عن أبسط الأسئلة التي وجهها إليه محررو الصحف الذين أرادوا معرفة كيف سيطبق سياسته الخاصة. وهنا أشار إلى الإحصائية من الشرق الأوسط، وهي عدد الفلسطينيين الذين قتلتهم إسرائيل في حرب غزة الأخيرة أخطأ بما يقارب 1000%. إلى الآن لم يتحمس مجتمع السياسة الخارجية لأي مرشح سواء وزيرة الخارجية السابقة المشاركة في السباق هيلاري كلينتون. وفي واقع الأمر وقع أكثر من 100 خبير جمهوري على خطاب وعدوا فيه بألا يعملوا حتى مع ترامب إن تولى الرئاسة. هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن سنسأل أما إذا كان لأي من هذا أهمية حقا. ماذا يلزم الرؤساء معرفته حقا لا يتحقق لهم النجاح؟ ما مدى أهمية الحدس مقارنة بالمعرفة؟ هل يتعين على الرئيس أن يملك خططا وسياسات تفصيلية لينجح في المكتب البيضاوي؟ لمناقشة هذه الأسئلة يسرني أن أرحب بلجنتنا التي تضم خبيري السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. We're sitting with our panel of foreign policy experts today to look at the basic question: what does a president really need to know to be successful in foreign policy? Gentlemen, we've had two candidates, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, either of whom don't know much at all about foreign policy, and they've shown that. One, Donald Trump says what he learns from foreign policy he gets from the Sunday morning talk shows. So let me ask you, what do presidents really need to know to be successful in the Oval Office? Dennis?
I do think some minimal knowledge base is essential because, in a sense, even if you have good instincts, you need to be able to make judgments. Someone like Ronald Reagan did not come in with a lot of deeply rooted knowledge in foreign policy, but he had a set of instincts, but then he also had people like George Shultz around him. So if you have good instincts and you have someone who's very solid, who's, I think, around you, I think you can make for good foreign policy and national security. In the end, what you need more than anything else is judgment. And so I think you're looking for those who have judgment. Being informed obviously helps to have judgment. Being smart helps, but you know, sometimes you can be very smart and make bad decisions, because in the end, it's a combination of instincts, experience, being prepared to listen, having people around you who will present you what the range of options are and the pros and cons so you can actually go through it. I mean, one of the things that's required is not to have a groupthink and not to have an ideologically driven approach that is so driven by a set of ideologies that you can't see what are the real circumstances and you can't judge them accordingly.
So one, smarts, intelligence, savvy, cunning. What are you looking for in the president?
Well, I think it's important to dissect what we mean about knowledge and foreign policy knowledge, because I think there's one thing to ask of any candidate to know sort of all the names of all the world leaders and all the capitals of the world. You know, that's a very kind of pedestrian kind of knowledge. But a president has to understand how the international system works. And he may not know the name of every country, but he better understand the importance of regions in the world and America's place in it. And so a demonstration of at least that sense of knowledge is important. Then to Dennis's point, not necessarily having an ideology, because I think that creates a rigidity in any president. He comes in with preconceived notions about America's role in the world and power, but every president has to have a theory of the case. You know, Ronald Reagan had a theory of the case in the context of the Cold War, and rejuvenating sort of America's predominance in the world, and that then drove a lot of the foreign policy decisions, and he did it with great expertise around him. And so I think that's important. And then, as we all know, instinct matters here, and judgment coming from that instinct. Any president coming into office will have to deal with crises that are unknown to us at the moment that that president takes the oath of office. And so we have to have confidence as Americans that this is somebody, regardless of depth of knowledge of foreign policy, that's going to have the right instincts and judgment to weather storms, to manage crises, and to be able to guide America in a very complicated global environment. I think that's the big question for any American president.
So you've worked with presidents who've come in with different theories of the case, to use Juan's term. How often do those theories get debunked by the facts that they face when they sit in the Oval Office?
I think fairly often. And that's, again, if you come in and you have a very rigid mindset, it's not just that you're going to be hit by surprises, that's a given. But it's also, you have to be open to the fact that circumstances change. It's not just the surprises. It may be that the kind of assumptions that you come in with, the reality tends to be somewhat different than you thought. And you have to be open enough to be able to adjust when the circumstances are different.
Give us an example from your experience.
Well, I think, I mean, I'll give you an example of someone. I'll take George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush came in, you know, he understood that everything was changing. I mean, you had a new leader in the Soviet Union. You had someone, Gorbachev, proclaiming new thinking. George H.W. Bush's first instincts were to say, all right, I want to be open to change, but you know, I want to know that the change is actually going to be real. So the impulse was to sort of be testing. Now, when the Berlin Wall came down, this looked like an extraordinary change, which it was. Now here, his judgment came to the fore. I mean, I recall that day, we were actually over in the Oval Office, and he says to all of us, we're not going to triumph this. We're not going to suddenly try to make it look like this is a great victory for us and it's a great defeat for them. So, you know, this is an important development. We need to think through how we're going to handle it. And what we don't want to do, in effect, is put the Soviet Union or its leadership in the corner. Now, you know, I think the natural impulse of most people that day was to get up and say, we won the Cold War. You know, this is an extraordinary day. And, you know, obviously there was some of that. But there was a kind of, in this case, he had the judgment to know we're going to have to manage change. And, you know, there's where if on day one or during the transition, you know, he had been told the Berlin Wall's coming down, you know, this year, in your first year. I think everyone would have said, you know, who's ever saying that is, you know, they have no idea. You know, yeah, things are changing, but they're not changing that way. Well, here was someone who actually had the capacity to adjust to what was a very different reality than one that had been predicted for him.
And what would be an example from your experience, Juan?
Well, watching the transition, I think, from the Bush administration to the Obama administration was interesting. Every administration comes in, every president comes in having created a political caricature of the existing state of play. Sure. And as Dennis said, a good president with the right instincts and judgment will reassess that on day one. I think one of the challenges for the Obama administration was that the political caricature of the Bush years, which really did have an evolution to them, wasn't taken fully into account in terms of the policies that were being laid out. And so a challenge for the Obama team was clearly this sense of Afghanistan having been the good war, Iraq having been the bad war. That then set the framework for how the policy was not only discussed but then articulated and put forward. And so you had the surge in Afghanistan, you had the drawdown in Iraq. And now, given what we've seen in some of the interviews with the president seems to regret both, or at least one of them, maybe not the other. But we're now challenged with the withdrawal out of Iraq when the situation changed. Maybe troops on the ground would have made more sense, more of a political push. It would have avoided some of the sectarian tension, maybe affected the rise of ISIS, at least in Iraq. And so having a caricature and a theory of the case that is not adapting to the environment is really problematic. The current candidates are going to have this problem, and you see this in particular on the Republican side when talking about the Iran deal, the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, because the tendency now in American political circles around foreign policy is to declare very clearly what you will do as president on day one. President Obama did it. You've seen it before. President Bush did it, for example, on North Korea and the transition from Clinton to the George W. Bush administration. And you now have these political promises of tearing up the deal, which without some reflection coming into the door in the Oval Office is probably not a good idea on day one.
So let me ask you both about a different but related phenomenon, and this is how we judge candidates by the company they keep. In this case, we have candidates on one hand, say Hillary Clinton, who has the entire Democratic political foreign policy establishment around her. Bernie Sanders has virtually none. Donald Trump has, shall we say, fringe of the Republican and independent foreign policy establishment. When we look back at time, is it fair to judge a candidate's foreign policy by the company they keep?
I think so, and I don't think it's dispositive or it doesn't necessarily.
Big word.
Sorry, no, it doesn't necessarily mean you can predict the direction of the foreign policy, but it does suggest the type of people that the president's going to be relying upon when making decisions. I can speak from experience watching the George W. Bush administration, where you had a long line of the Republican establishment in foreign policy backing President Bush and supporting him. Folks like Dr. Rice, who were seen as incredibly important and ascendant national security advisors. And so that gives one comfort because you know, in part, not only that the president-elect or the candidate is getting good advice, or at least knowledgeable advice, but you can also read and understand what kind of advice, understanding the writings, the speeches, the other actions of those advisors, and you can divine a bit as to how that president then is going to be seeing the world and how they may implement policy. So I think it's very important, but it's not going to necessarily determine the future of the foreign policy of the president, because as Dennis said, any good president is going to see the world differently on day one and moving into the Oval Office, and will no doubt assign people, hopefully, who are serious and knowledgeable in key posts to execute foreign policy for him or her.
Okay, when we come back, I'm going to ask you, Dennis, your view on this, the company you keep when you're president, and we'll talk more about how the world views our foreign policy debate in our presidential election in just a moment. Again, our panel of foreign policy experts includes Juan Zarate. Juan is a senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and senior national security consultant and analyst for CBS News. One of our nation's leading counterterrorism and national security experts, he served in the administration of President George W. Bush as assistant to the president and deputy national security advisor. His experience as the first ever Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Terrorist Financing is the subject of his excellent book, Treasury's War, The Unleashing of a New Era of Financial Warfare. Sitting to his right is Dennis Ross, my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which he rejoined after 3 years' service in the Obama administration, first in the State Department and then as Senior Director for the Central Region, that's the Middle East, on the National Security Council. Dennis has a quarter-century experience at high levels in government, including White House tours in the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations, and service as the president's special envoy for Middle East peace. So, Dennis, does it matter the company that a president keeps?
I do think it does, because particularly if a president comes in and has very limited background in foreign policy, then you need some indicators of how the president is going to approach problems. The less the president has been immersed in these kinds of issues, the more the president needs to be surrounded by people who have been, even if they're not all of like mind, that's fine. You need diversity around presidents, but you need people who have demonstrated some capacity to understand these issues through what they've written, through what they've said, through what they've actually done in the past. So to have people who would come in without that, I think would be a source of some concern. And I think it would be a source of some concern to the rest of the world, because there'd be a feeling of great unpredictability. I don't think the world, at a time when it's going through a lot of upheaval, needs an image of great uncertainty about what the United States is likely to do.
Well, that leads me to my next question. How do you think the world is looking at our foreign policy debate? You both travel quite a bit. You take the pulse of elites and foreign policymakers around the globe. How do you think they see what's going on here? Juan?
Well, some of them with a little bit of ridicule, a little bit of confusion, but there is also hopefulness, especially colleagues in the Middle East.
So do you think, as Juan suggested, that some of our aggrieved allies, what one might call derisively our free riders, are looking for just about anybody to come and change the diskette, have a different approach in next
Well,
January?
I think provided that in fact you see, as I said, an American president who in their eyes is less hesitant about the role of American power in the world. Doesn't seem to think that at this point global norms already are establishing and enforcing themselves, and who believes that, you know, every time you use American power, it doesn't necessarily produce a negative outcome.
There's a tension here too in the political debate. As Dennis said, this wave of populism that is defining the Bernie Sanders movement on the Democratic side and seems to be defining the Trump movement also has a very sharp streak of isolationism. And I think understanding how that streak persists, regardless of who wins, if it's a President Clinton, that streak still persists. But there's a dynamic tension because there's a sense that any president who comes in is going to want to reassert power. And a lot of the friends and colleagues I talk to around the world see Donald Trump, for example, as someone who by his very disposition is a more authoritative, powerful figure. And that unto itself is more reassuring.
Even if he advocates
withdrawal, right.
withdrawal.
So that's why I say there's a real tension there in the view of what's happening in the United States. And it's to be forgiven because I think we're all still trying to figure that out. What is happening in terms of our view of ourselves in the world? Are we going to withdraw? Are we going to be more limited in how we think about the use of military power or economic power or diplomacy? You know, what is the role of America? And I think that's a debate we haven't fully had in this political debate. I'm hoping that that becomes a key part of the presidential debate once the two candidates are selected. But that's certainly something that is at play, and certainly something that our foreign friends are looking to figure out.
Trump has vowed that this is as much a theme of attack and vulnerability for Hillary Clinton, not necessarily a Hillary Clinton advantage. Do you see that possibility playing out?
Well, I think, again, understand what both Trump and Sanders represent. They're not something that, let me put it this way, they each reflect what are historical antecedents. We have a tradition in part of our body politic historically of isolationism. Now there's different strains of isolationism. There's a belligerent isolationism, which Trump embodies. The belligerent isolationism is about, yeah, we'll use force, but we'll do it alone. We don't want to be encumbered by allies. We don't want to be entangled. We want to have obligations to anybody else. We want to be free to be able to do whatever we want. Someone like Senator Bora from the 1930s was sort of the embodiment of that, and Trump in many ways really reflects it. In Sanders' case, Sanders is very much a pacifistic isolationist whose instinct is just not to be involved. His instinct is not to be engaged in conflict, that if we don't engage ourselves in conflict, you know, we'll be free from it. And so those are not new elements in the American psyche. They've been there throughout our history. What I think is different this time is that we're worried that there's two candidates who are prominent in this regard. And because of the last decade or so and the high cost of military engagement abroad, there's somewhat more of an appeal. I do think in the fall campaign, when we have two candidates and there's a debate, this role in the world will be debated. And I think, and I would put it this way, that one of the reasons ultimately I think it doesn't work towards an isolationist orientation, 94% of the American public were aware of the beheadings. 94%. You can't find any other issue on which 94% of the American public are in fact aware. And President Obama's approval ratings have gone up. 53% approval ratings overall, but 37% in foreign policy. And that suggests, again, this image of retrenchment is not necessarily where the public ultimately wants to be.
But we're going to have to break it off, but this is going to be a show that we're going to be continuing on in the future, because I'm sure Donald Trump is going to take that number and try to use it to his advantage. We're going to go after these guys, but whether that means isolation or engagement on the morning after is still the open question. Gentlemen, we'll be back to continue this discussion on a future show. Thank you for joining me. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول النقاشات حول السياسة الخارجية في حملتنا الرئاسية، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.